It took exactly 47 seconds for the meticulous facade of constitutional rectitude to crumble. 4 to 7 seconds of dead air in the hot Senate office building, following the direct question about what Director Patel knew concerning the vetting of President Hayes' cabinet nominees, specifically, their documented connection to the late Jeffrey Epstein. The truth, in that silent, crystalline moment, was revealed not through words, but through the witness's absolute, debilitating paralysis. The room was the familiar, chilling stage of political consequence, hearing room SH-216, home to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, SSCI. Every detail screamed permanence and power. The high, Corford ceiling absorbed the light from the powerful Klieg lamps above, casting a fluorescent pallor over the witness table. Behind the curved dais of senators, the mahogany paneling gleamed darkly, reflecting the harsh camera lights like polished mirrors. The only sound, before the proceeding began, was the faint, rhythmic thunk of a Senate aide placing a new carafe of iced water on the end of the long table, a mundane counterpoint to the impending political execution. At the center of the attention sat Anil Patel, former director of the Office of Presidential Personnel, a man whose career was built on impeccable discretion and the quiet, administrative mastery of the federal appointments process. Patel was thin, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, the knot of his tie tight and precise, mimicking the legal discipline he was supposed to embody. He had the wary, intelligent eyes of someone who spent years reading highly classified assessments and making decisions based on weighted probabilities. His hands rested flat on the leather-metalled surface of the table, perfectly still, only the slightest tremor visible beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The air was heavy, thick with unstated antagonism. This was not a policy hearing, it was an inquest into institutional negligence and potential cover-up. The committee's chair, Senator Dianne Harris, sat grimly at the center, flanked by the lead prosecutor in this interrogation, Senator Adam Schiff, positioned slightly to her left. Schiff, a man known for his forensic legal mind and almost surgical cross-examination style, adjusted his microphone, the small static pop sounding like a gunshot in the sterile silence. The setup was deliberate, the witness table positioned low, forcing Patel to look up at his interrogators, the Senate seal dominating the wall behind the committee, the 5 large, black television cameras, each lens a silent, unblinking eye, broadcasting the scene to the nation. Today, the core issue was simple. 2 of the administration's most crucial cabinet picks had demonstrated highly suspicious financial and social connections to the disgraced financial predator, Jeffrey Epstein, connections that standard, mandatory security vetting should have flagged and disqualified. The question was whether Patel, the ultimate gatekeeper, had missed it, or deliberately ignored it. The tone of the room, the silent, expectant scribbling of the press corps in the overflow seats, and the intense focus of Senator Schiff signaled that missing it was not an acceptable answer. The moral weight of the question transcended simple political error. It touched on the betrayal of public trust at the highest level of the executive branch. Patel cleared his throat, a dry, nervous sound that the microphone amplified unnervingly. He was ready to defend the standard operating procedures, the sheer volume of appointments he handled, and the technical defense that the disclosures were not legally disqualifying on their own. He was prepared for an abstract legal fight, but not for the moral confrontation he was about to face. But the silence wasn't over yet. Senator Schiff leaned forward, his voice a low, almost conversational register, initially focusing on procedure to lull the witness into a state of technical confidence. Director Patel, let's start simply. The vetting process under your tenure required comprehensive financial and personal disclosures under the Ethics in Government Act of 1978, specifically Title I, Sections 102 and 103. Is that correct? Patel nodded once, firmly. That is correct, Senator. Every nominee submits a standard Form 278, detailing all sources of income, assets, liabilities, and any relevant non-governmental organizational affiliations. He maintained rigid eye contact, his composure seemingly unshakable. Schiff continued, his questioning deceptively calm, building a foundation of undeniable facts. He spent nearly 10 minutes establishing the due diligence required, the layered review process, and Patel's ultimate signature authority. Director, Schiff shifted, lifting a single, stapled document, plain white paper against the mahogany. I refer now to a document publicly released by the committee last month, detailing the risk assessment disclosure threshold criteria implemented by your office in Q3 of last year. This memo, titled PPD 19-04, requires mandatory elevation for any nominee showing unaccounted for international travel history or disproportionate non-liquid gifts exceeding 5 figures from a single, non-familial source. Did you author or approve PPD 19-04? Patel paused, the technical defense he had prepared suddenly feeling distant. I approved the policy, Senator. It was a measure to tighten due diligence concerning foreign influence and non-traditional financial conflicts. He tried to frame it as proof of competence. Good, Schiff replied, his voice still measured. Now, let's apply PPD 19-04 to two specific nominees, Secretary of Commerce, Robert Hastings, and former Attorney General, Sophia Chen. Can you confirm for the record that both individuals were subject to the mandatory elevation process under PPD 19-04? Patel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes darted momentarily to his legal counsel, a stout man who remained impassive. The confirmation, though procedural, marked the official entry into the danger zone. Yes, Senator, they were. Both clearances were elevated, reviewed, and ultimately signed off on. Schiff's focus sharpened, his calm demeanor now feeling subtly predatory. Director, when an elevation is triggered by a disclosure of unaccounted-for international travel, as was the case for Mr. Hastings, did your team document the specific, non-governmental entity responsible for facilitating that travel, as required by Section 3(c) of PPD 19-04? Patel hesitated. This was the first legal seam. He knew the answer was administratively damning. Senator, the travel was documented. The specific facilitating entity was flagged internally, reviewed for compliance against existing statute, and deemed insufficient reason for disqualification. He used the passive voice, trying to divorce himself from the decision. Deemed insufficient by whom, Director? By you? Schiff pressed, the tempo rising just a beat. And more importantly, does the name Jeffrey Epstein appear anywhere on the flagged documentation related to the facilitating entity for Secretary Hastings' unaccounted-for travel disclosure? Patel froze for a fraction of a second, a visible flash of fear in his eyes quickly extinguished by rigid self-control. He picked up his glass of water, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor running through his hand. He placed the glass down, opting for silence over a direct lie or an unauthorized disclosure. The answer, when it came, was a masterpiece of administrative deflection, but legally porous. Senator, I cannot discuss the contents of classified vetting material in this open setting. I must defer to the classification limitations imposed under the Classified Information Procedures Act, CIPA, to protect the integrity of the appointments process and source information. Schiff leaned back, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Duly noted, Director. But the committee is not asking for raw source material, merely procedural acknowledgement of a name already in the public domain. Your continued refusal under CIPA suggests that the name, Mr. Epstein, is indeed inextricably linked to the risk assessment disclosure for a sitting cabinet secretary. But the silence wasn't over yet. The air had grown colder, the investigative tone shedding its last vestiges of courtesy. Schiff picked up a new document, this one bearing large, stark black redaction boxes, the visible text beneath confirming it was an internal White House personnel memorandum. He held it up, allowing the camera lens to capture the administrative weight of the paper. Director Patel, let us move beyond CIPA limitations and focus on the administrative paper trail you controlled. I refer to Internal Memorandum WHPP 20-41C, dated October 14. Schiff stated, his voice now sharp, metallic. This document is a request for expedited sign-off on the clearances for both Hastings and Chen. Your signature is undeniably present on the final approval line, overriding the recommendation of the Chief Compliance Officer, whose note, here in the margin, explicitly states, requires further review regarding assets discrepancy in Section 102(c), conflict. Patel shifted in his seat, the subtle movement revealing a fraying control. Senator, that memo reflects a standard procedural acceleration requested by the Chief of Staff. The sign-off simply affirms that the necessary statutory disclosures were made, not that the conduct disclosed was inherently acceptable or ideal. My role was to affirm legal compliance, not moral judgment. But your role, under Presidential Executive Order 13488, is to ensure the highest integrity of appointments, specifically mitigating any conflicts that could compromise the administration. You had an explicit warning from your own officer regarding a discrepancy in assets, Schiff countered, placing the legal failure precisely. Let's look at that discrepancy. Former Attorney General Chen's financial disclosure, Form 278, lists a transfer of a non-liquid asset, a deed to a Bahamian property interest, valued at an estimated $1.8 million, received in 2018. Where does that asset transfer appear on her initial disclosure to the White House counsel's office, Director? Patel swallowed hard, a visible knot in his throat. This was the trap. The specific details of the asset transfer were provided in an appendix to the initial disclosure, Senator. It met the minimum requirement for documentation. Appendix, Schiff repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Let's be precise. Section 102 of the Ethics in Government Act requires clear, mandatory listing of all major assets and gifts over $5,000 on the main disclosure form. Failing to list a $1.8 million asset transfer on the main form, burying it in an appendix, is not minimum documentation, it's a calculated concealment. And your signature approved that failure. Schiff pointed a sharp finger at the memo. My legal counsel advised that the inclusion in the appendix satisfied the spirit of the disclosure requirements, Patel insisted, his voice slightly higher pitched. Schiff ignored the defense, pivoting to the core legal stake. The spirit doesn't matter, Director. The law is clear. By signing off on that clearance, you actively permitted the violation of 18 U.C. Section 208, which prohibits executive branch employees from participating in matters where they have a financial interest. Chen's acceptance of an asset tied to a known international criminal enterprise, regardless of how it was documented, should have triggered an immediate referral to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation, under the mandate of the Government Accountability Act of 1980. You circumvented the entire referral process, correct? Patel stammered, searching for a legalistic shield. Senator, I was operating under the authority delegated by the Executive Office, balancing expediency with, expediency for whom, Director? Schiff cut in, his voice rising sharply for the first time. The room hushed entirely. Was the need for expediency related to the fact that the facilitating entity for both Hastings Travel and Chen's asset transfer was the same, now-defunct corporate shell linked directly to Jeffrey Epstein's estate? The light caught a drop of sweat rolling down Patel's temple. He looked physically ill, the legalistic walls he had built crumbling fast. He was trapped between protecting the White House and committing blatant perjury. But the silence wasn't over yet. Schiff's previous question, linking the financial discrepancies directly to Epstein's corporate shell, hung in the air, a physical weight pressing down on Director Patel. The committee room was now utterly silent, save for the low, continuous whir of the ventilation system and the faint scratching of a pen on paper from the press section. The senator waited, allowing the gravity of the legal implication to sink in. Patel's rigid posture began to crack. His eyes, which had maintained forced contact with Schiff, suddenly lost focus, darting wildly around the room, to the ceiling, to the water pitcher, back to his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. He had prepared for a factual defense of procedure, he had not prepared for the public convergence of the sordid and the systemic. Schiff delivered the final, non-abstract question, driving the legal spike home. Director Patel, in the clearance memoranda for Secretary Hastings and former Attorney General Chen, did you personally flag and subsequently waive the mandatory requirement under the Office of Management and Budget Circular A11 to provide full transparency regarding all non-federal remuneration sources exceeding $25,000, knowing that the source, in this specific case, was directly traceable to a legal entity known as the Nexus Trust, an entity subsequently proven to be a central financial clearinghouse for Jeffrey Epstein's private operations? The answer required was a single, direct admission of guilt and a clear statement regarding the violation of administrative law. Patel knew if he denied knowledge, he risked an immediate charge of perjury under 18 U.S.C. Section 1621. If he admitted the waiver and the knowledge of the Nexus Trust, he was admitting to criminal misprision of felony and conspiracy to obstruct justice, defined under 18 U.C. Section 3 and 18 U.C. Section 1505. He froze. The committee clock on the wall above the chair's head ticked soundlessly. The camera lenses tightened their focus on the director's face. 1 second. Patel's breath hitched, a dry, rasping sound. His right hand, which had been steady, began to shake violently against the table edge. The fluorescent light seemed to emphasize the sheen of sweat on his forehead. 20 seconds. The silence became agonizing. It was no longer a tactical pause, it was a visible mental collapse. He was searching for a legal loophole, a constitutional exit, but there was none. The failure was baked into the administrative act itself. He had prioritized political expediency over the clear mandate of federal law. 40 seconds. Patel tried to speak. His lips parted, but no sound emerged, only a faint, choking rattle. He knew that his silence was now legally interpreted as a refusal to cooperate, a clear act of contempt and obstruction of a congressional investigation. This refusal, in the context of the explicit, non-abstract question, was tantamount to a tacit admission of the underlying facts. 4 to 7 seconds. The director suddenly slammed his shaking hand down on the table, a loud, unexpected crack that echoed through the room, making several journalists gasp. He lurched forward, gripping the microphone stand. "Senator," he croaked, his voice raw, stripped of all professionalism. I was instructed that the political cost of delaying those confirmations was greater than the administrative risk." The admission was fatal. It was not a defense, it was the exposure of the mechanism of institutional corruption. His failure was not merely an administrative oversight, it was the knowing violation of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment by enabling individuals with clear, undisclosed conflicts to wield the power of the federal government, thereby sacrificing the constitutional rights of the public to honest governance for political gain. The admission that the instruction was given, and that he followed it, legally exposed him to charges of conspiracy to commit offenses against the United States, defined under 18 U.S.C. Section 371. He had exposed the systemic rot. But the silence wasn't over yet. The chairman, Senator Harris, struck her gavel 3 times, the sharp, authoritative blows cutting through the stunned room. "This committee stands in recess," she announced into a hot microphone, her voice tight with legal shock. The room instantly erupted, a chaotic, physical reaction to the preceding 47 seconds of exposed truth. Cameramen scrambled, sound technicians ripped off their headphones, and the press corps surged toward the dais, shouting questions that were swallowed by the noise. Within the hour, the moment became institutional history. The footage, Patel's initial rigidity, the wild-eyed darting, the dry, desperate crack of his hand on the wood, and the final, self-incriminating admission, was placed on immediate, endless rotation across every major news network. On MSNBC, former federal prosecutor, Eliza Vance, leaned into the camera with grim certainty. Constitutional scholars called it the most devastating Senate takedown since Watergate. For 47 seconds, America watched competence collapse, followed by a confession of criminal intent. Patel's claim that he was instructed to prioritize political cost over administrative risk is the key. It moves this from a breach of ethics to a clear case of obstruction of Congress and conspiracy. He didn't just break a rule, he violated the integrity of the Appointments Clause. Across town on Fox News, legal analyst Douglas Kane focused on the legal precision of Schiff's attack. The key wasn't the Epstein name, the key was Schiff targeting the administrative failure to follow OMB Circular A11 and the Ethics in Government Act. Patel's breakdown wasn't emotional, it was the sudden, crippling realization that Schiff had proof he had personally signed the waiver that facilitated the cover-up. The failure to refer the matter to the DOJ, as mandated by the Government Accountability Act, is a separate, clear-cut administrative felony. The institutional consequences were swift and brutal. By late afternoon, the White House press secretary gave a terse, 4-line statement confirming Director Patel's resignation, effective immediately. The President's Counsel began the process of severing Patel's official access, locking down all internal files related to the vetting process, a move immediately characterized by the press as an attempt at evidence containment. The Department of Justice, under mounting public and congressional pressure, issued an ambiguous statement affirming their review of the hearing transcript for potential criminal referrals. The political fallout extended immediately to the cabinet. Calls for the resignation of Secretary Hastings and former Attorney General Chen, the 2 officials whose vetting Patel had illegally expedited, intensified into an unmanageable roar. For the Senate, the moment had delivered a crucial institutional win, proof that its oversight role, backed by judicial application of law, could still expose the rot at the highest level of the executive branch. The damage was not to a personality, but to the institutional trust in the appointments process itself, a system built on the quiet faith that its guardians would adhere to the Constitution's most rigorous standards, regardless of political pressure. The 47-second crack was the sound of that trust shattering. But the silence wasn't over yet. The adrenaline of the collapse faded, replaced by the cold, enduring calculation of institutional reality. A week after the hearing, the immediate chaos settled into the protracted process of political triage and legal accountability. Director Patel was not merely fired, he was institutionally quarantined. The political structure, often accused of being a monolith, had swiftly excised the compromised element, demonstrating its ultimate priority, self-preservation through the appearance of justice. The subsequent Department of Justice investigation focused narrowly on the 18 U.S.C. Section 1001 violation, making false statements to Congress, and 18 U.S.C. Section 1505, obstruction, stemming from the specific, admitted political waiver of the OMB requirements. The charge avoided the broader, more damaging allegation of conspiracy, which would have implicated the executive office itself. This was the system's quiet compromise, punishing the functionary without collapsing the entire structure. Patel's moral failure, the choice to prioritize a political instruction over a constitutional oath, was now packaged and delivered as a technical administrative crime. Patel's fate was a stark reminder of the unforgiving calculus of Washington. His defense, based on the abstract notion of balancing political necessity, held no legal weight against the explicit text of the Ethics in Government Act. He had gambled his career on the assumption that the institutional necessity of silence would protect him. He lost because the institutional necessity of oversight proved momentarily stronger. His knowledge of the Epstein-related vetting issues was irrelevant in the courtroom. The only thing that mattered was his act of signing off on the non-compliant clearances. The calm, closing assessment of the event was delivered months later by a retired Supreme Court justice speaking at a law school forum. The Patel hearing was not about high-stakes espionage or grand conspiracy. It was about the slow, corrosive effect of petty political loyalty overriding clear administrative law. The breakdown happened not when the senator asked the question, but years earlier, when the director first confused the president's political interests with the national legal interest. Patel ultimately pleaded guilty to a single count of obstruction of Congress, his legal fate sealed not by the scandal he tried to conceal, but by the legal mechanism he used to conceal it. His career was a perfect arc of ambition leading to administrative destruction. The Hart Senate Office Building hearing room soon hosted another inquiry, the mahogany gleaming, the cameras rolling, the constitutional logic once again the subject of ritualized drama. The only trace of the 47-second collapse was a barely perceptible indentation on the witness table where Patel had slammed his hand down, a tiny mark that only the most meticulous maintenance staff would notice and quickly polish over. The system had moved on. Washington doesn't punish ignorance. It replaces it.